Buongiorno, vi prego di prendere posto. Prego uno di voi due, Roberta, please. La professoressa Raggi mi aveva ordinato di introdurre questo incontro di oggi in inglese. Se potete venire un attimo uno di voi due e porgere questo foglio per favore al professor Matthews. Thank you. Mi aveva ordinato di svolgere il mio intervento, ma siccome io qui sono il padrone di casa, mi prendo la libertà di intervenire in italiano, perché come ho spiegato ad Alan Matthews, non voglio far perdere neanche un briciolo di pathos di questo incontro odierno, che ha un senso, come ho scritto qui nel mio quadernino di appunti, ha un senso molto importante per la nostra comunità scientifica. Universitas Mercatorum ha quest'anno il privilegio di ospitare questo evento dedicato a ricordare e rendere vivo il lascito culturale. La parola legacy in inglese la traduco fortemente come lascito culturale e umano del professor Luca Salvatici. L'iniziativa di quest'oggi è un'iniziativa che come rettore ho voluto fortemente appoggiare, così come il successivo convegno della società che inizieremo domani. È un'iniziativa che, come dire, condividiamo con Roma 3, con l'Associazione Rossidoria e con l'AIEAA, 3 istituzioni alle quali Luca ha dato un contributo. Nei miei appunti ha cooperato strongly, ha dato un contributo significativo. Personalmente ho conosciuto Luca da dottorando in Sapienza, dopo che Michele De Benedictis inaugurò. Nei miei appunti c'è la parola cenacolo, un cenacolo presso la facoltà di economia di Roma Sapienza. Era una stagione nuova, diversa. L'ho conosciuto quando aveva appena finito il periodo di dottorato. L'ho chiamato nel 2003 in Molise, dove ero rettore, come ricercatore, dove lui è rimasto in quella posizione non più di 1 anno e mezzo, 2, perché nel 2004 e dal 2004 al 2011 Luca è stato professore associato in quella università e devo dire che si è subito impegnato in una cosa che era fortemente caratterizzante la sua persona. Si è impegnato a costruire un gruppo di ricerca formando giovani ricercatori, giovani che imparavano a studiare allora, ce n'è qualcuno in questa sala, e che ha percorso poi gli sviluppi successivi fino ai ruoli di professore di prima fascia. Questa azione di mentoring è un'azione importante nella cultura e nella vita di Luca. Dopo il trasferimento, dopo che ha lasciato Molise, dopo il trasferimento a Roma 3, devo dire che io ho avuto modo e piacere di collaborare ancora con Luca, che mi ha dato una mano significativa nel selezionare nuove risorse umane, alcune delle quali presenti in questa sala. Il ricordo di Luca è saldamente connesso, lo voglio dire, a quello di Giovanni Anania, anche lui scomparso prematuramente. E voglio ricordare Luca come uno studioso curioso, competente, con una grande attenzione per la utilità sociale delle sue ricerche, dove andavano a finire, che era poi un tratto in comune con Giovanni. Grande attenzione ai metodi, grande attenzione alle elaborazioni, ma poi che cosa succede? Con una grande attenzione voglio ricordare Luca come attento, diciamo, qui una parola importante, perché le parole sono importanti, alla qualità della ricerca. E non a caso la tanto da noi ricordata ANVUR ha ricordato la qualità della ricerca di Luca nel suo messaggio di obituaries, perché Luca aveva presieduto un gruppo che si occupava di qualità della ricerca. La presenza di studiosi nel programma odierno è il risultato, e questo è un altro aspetto importante, di una rete tessuta grazie all'impegno e al profilo scientifico solido, riconosciuto e apprezzato. Solido, riconosciuto e apprezzato. Discutiamo oggi del lascito di uno studioso appassionato della sua professione, costantemente animato da un sentimento di generosità intellettuale, ma anche discutiamo della legacy di uno studioso ricco di una profonda ma limpida umanità. E questo è il mio saluto augurale. Grazie. E ora la parola è a Mary Raggi.
Okay, so I will try to speak in English or maybe mix Italian and English, we'll see. So good morning to everyone. I am the president of AIEAA, so the Italian Association of Agriculture and Applied Economics. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, all of you, to be here, and also the people online. So just 2 words about AIEAA. Is a scientific association. The aim is not the only aim, but one of the aim is to stimulate and try to increase the debate and the research about bioeconomy, where agricultural economics and policy are integrated, and also in a multidisciplinary way. The members of AIEAA have deal with a lot of topics. So I will tell something, but I'm sure I will forget something else. So agricultural economics, food economics, development, environmental resource management, trade, and many others. So we are a very multidisciplinary society. Just to recall 2 assets of AIEAA, the Congress, so the conference that starts this afternoon with the pre-conference, and the 2 days of conference that from Tuesday and Friday. In the conference, there are more or less 200 of participants. So it's not so big conference, but it's not so small. I think it's a quite good compromise about this organization of the conference. And the second asset, very important of AIEAA, is bio. So we have a scientific journal, quite young, because he has only 15 years, but he's already indexed in Scopus, and also he has an impact factor. And before anything else, I need to thank 2 colleagues, Margherita and Donato. They had the idea of this initiative, not only the idea. They construct the event. They decide the topics, they call the people, they invite the participants. So I really say thank to these 2 colleagues for organizing this event. Another thank, I have to address another thank to the organizing entities. So Roma 3, the center, the Rossi Doria Center, and the Mercatorum University to support us and to collaborate with us for this organization. Last, thank, but not least, to the presenter, so the people that accept our invitation to be here. I will say very few words about Luca, because I think I'm not the right person to do that, because you and also Margherita are are more adequate, because you know better Luca. I just spoke with him few times, but I want to remember Luca as an active member of AIEAA. He helped us to construct and to develop AIEAA, and I want to remember that he was one of the promote and organizing the summer school. I think that this reflects his commitment to support young research. The topic you will discuss today reflects the issue of research agenda of Luca. I hope that it's not only a day, so it's not only one day that we remember Luca, but I hope it is a kind of continuation of the conversation, of the discussion, the scientific discussion that that takes a lot of part of his academic life. So thank you to be here again, and I hope you wish a stimulating and meaningful event. Thank you.
Ora l'intervento di Donato Romano.
Okay, I am not Director Magnificus, so I will keep speaking in English, I guess. Please, I hope that you pardon me if I read something, because I don't want that the emotion could undermine what I would like to say. We have already remembered Luca in other occasions over the last year. We have spoken of his human qualities, his dedication, loyalty, generosity, and wit. And today we will remember him in terms of his own scientific contributions. But what I would like to emphasize is that the combination of these traits, his human quality and his professional excellence, is what made Luca an outstanding economist, a valued colleague, and a friend to many of us. Here, I'm wearing the hat of the Rossi Doria Center for today. And I would like to recall a few aspects of an area of Luca's work that is perhaps less widely known, precisely his role as a director of the Rossi Doria Center. From the center establishment in 2013 and later in his role as director from 2024, Luca, jointly with the other members of the executive board, I want to mention Guido Fabiani, Anna Giunta, Mara Giua, and Anna Carbone, I was saying Luca undoubtedly shaped its scientific direction, giving it an innovative, rigorous, forward-looking, and international-oriented profile. For the sake of brevity, I will mention only 3 areas in which his contribution was especially important, areas that also speak directly to the themes that of this morning's event. First, the center was among the very few institutions in Italy, in collaboration with the Italian trade agency, ICE, to produce studies on the impact of free trade agreements for Europe and Italy. These included agreements with Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Canada, and Mercosur. A common feature of these studies was the methodology employed. Counterfactual simulation based on the dynamic computable general equilibrium model, the GTAP, of which Luca was one of the leading international experts. Second, the center was also among the first in Italy to launch research activities on global value chains. The emergence of a new world in which trade no longer concerned only final goods exchange among countries, as in the original Ricardo's model, but also intermediate goods exchange among firms, immediately activated what I would call the multiplier scientific interest that characterized Luca. And the Rossi Doria Center benefited enormously from this intellectual energy, becoming a national reference point for research on global value chains. Third, there were the advanced training initiatives on impact evaluation. The center indeed has promoted a training school on for public officials, researchers, PhD graduates, and doctoral students on the evaluation of public policy impacts. Moreover, together with other 3 public universities in Rome and the support of the Rome-based UN agencies, the center contributed to the creation of the International School on Impact Evaluation and Development Policies. It was Luca who, with conviction, perseverance, and a genuine pedagogical commitment, organized concrete initiatives aimed at strengthening the culture of policy evaluation in the country. Finally, let me emphasize one aspect that made him especially dear to me, and that is defining traits of a true mentor. His constant attention, as already Gianni has emphasized, to young scholars. Luca personally, and the center under his direction, was one of the pillars of the Summer School on Evidence-Based Policymaking named after Giovanni Nania, which is organized every 2 years in collaboration with the University of Calabria and AIEAA. He showed this commitment to younger generations on many other occasions as well, by responding enthusiastically to the first call for the mentoring program of the European Association of Agricultural Economists, by participating in the discussion group on the challenges facing PhD education in economics, PhD program in economics in Italy, promoted by the Italian Economic Association, by relentlessly promoting young scholars in the many projects he was involved in. And through the care, I would like to emphasize also this one, he devoted to continuously innovating his teaching at every level, whether in doctoral programs, master courses, or even bachelor courses. In short, I would like to emphasize that what makes an excellent economist, also a true mentor, is above all the sets of human qualities that make that person a point of reference, an example, and a guide for younger colleagues. The clearest testimony of these qualities of Lucas is offered by the young colleagues who are here today to remember him and honor him, whether as speakers or as organizers of this event. To all of them, I extend my personal thanks, as well as the gratitude of the Rossi Doria Center for Economic Research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary and Donato. Ed ora la parola a Margherita Scoppola per la sua introduzione. Forse sarebbe il caso che i relatori di questa sessione venissero qui al tavolo.
And Luigi, do you want to come up? Yeah? No. Luca non c'è. Ma non so se... Luca, do you want to come as well? Luca. No? Poi metteteli come volete, però seguiamo noi delle Ilaria non c'è, so questo funziona così. So good morning to everyone. I'm Margherita Scoppolo from the University of Macerata. And of course, I start by a lot of thanks to everybody, to all of you first that are coming here to this day to celebrate our memories and the legacy of Luca. And also I would like to thank the four associations, the four institutions, let's say, the Department of Economics of Roma University, the Centro Rosidora, the University of Mercatorum, and AIEAA, of course, for giving me this honor to contribute to organize this event. I don't want to take the time to our speakers, so I just would like to introduce them, of course, but also highlight what is the spirit of this event. And so what are the origins of this and what is the underlying spirit? The idea of organizing a scientific event in memory of Luca dates back to 1 year ago, in the weeks immediately following his passing. By that time, we did not do it immediately because we wished to organize an event that was as well as we could and to properly honor Luca's memory and legacy. At that time, we feel that Luca would have been happy to see that his colleagues and friends continues to meet, to discuss all the topics with which he was deeply engaged. So, in our view, the best way to remember Luca is to contribute to continuing his work. And this is the spirit of this event. So, what we would like to do is to provide a sort of state-of-the-art overview and discuss future perspectives on the key issues and research topics that Luca addressed throughout his career. Of course, this is not an easy task, as Luca was extraordinarily active across several fields, methodologies, research directions, and this for many, many years. Furthermore, he had a strong interest in methodological challenges, in policy analysis, but also, as Giovanni Cannato was underlined before, in the relevance of what he was doing, and so also in the policy implications and the relevance for policymaking. At the same time, he was also deeply committed to understanding what was going on in the real world, in the international policy arena. So in half a day, we cannot do everything. This is clear. So what we did is that we tried to involve in this initiative a number of distinguished colleagues that actually have been working on the topics of Luca and actually have been working with Luca. All together, they reflect the way Luca approached his work, sharing scientific interests while building lasting friendships. All of them were not only a valid co-author, but also a good friend. So, sorry for that. We really thank you to accept this invitation. So before starting our conference, I would like to invite here a surprise, which is the son of Luca, Pietro, who would like to say something to start this conference.
Hello, everyone. As a premise, I apologize to the English speakers, but the following will be in Italian, although I will be happy to provide a translation if anybody will be interested. I can assure you it will not be economics related, so don't worry if that's what you're here for. Sì, non penso di dovermi presentare, sono Pietro, il secondogenito di Luca Salvatici, e sono qui per rubarvi davvero pochissimo tempo, solamente dirvi qualche parola, a partire da parole che però non sono le mie, ma di una persona che oggi non è qui con noi in questa sala, e cioè di mia madre, di nostra madre, mia e di mio fratello Enrico, che per l'appunto ha scritto un messaggio che voleva condividere con tutti voi, al quale adesso dunque mi riferirò. Scusate. Con questo messaggio che affido ad Enrico e Pietro vorrei fare i miei più sinceri ringraziamenti a tutti voi per aver organizzato questa giornata. Sapere che siete qui per riconoscere la sua eredità professionale e per proseguire il suo lavoro è il modo migliore per ricordarlo. Conosco personalmente tutti gli oratori di questo evento e so quanto Luca li stimasse, ne sarebbe orgoglioso. Luca ha avuto una vita lavorativa ricca di soddisfazioni, anche se con qualche frustrazione nella sua carriera accademica, sempre superata con la consapevolezza di ciò che valeva e delle sue capacità di costruire collaborazioni confrontandosi con colleghi in molte parti d'Italia e del mondo. Aveva la rara capacità di unire una grande competenza professionale a rapporti umani sinceri. Ovunque andasse, riusciva a creare collaborazioni di lavoro e amicizie personali, che, come molti di voi sanno, spesso si consolidavano intorno ad una tavola imbandita o al suo prezioso barbecue. Il periodo di studio a Davis in California per il PhD aveva avuto come effetto collaterale un altro titolo di cui era effettivamente orgogliosissimo, che è quello di Master of BBQ. Io lavoro in un altro campo, quello della ricerca medico-biologica. In 30 anni di vita insieme, le nostre esistenze si sono intrecciate in una condivisione totale. Solo i nostri mondi professionali sono rimasti distinti. Hanno camminato paralleli, pur condividendo ogni giorno frustrazioni, soddisfazioni, dubbi e entusiasmi, ma sono rimasti separati. Quest'anno per me è stato durissimo. Al di fuori dei figli, della famiglia e degli amici, proprio il mio lavoro, l'unica parte della mia vita in cui Luca era estraneo, è diventato una sorta di rifugio, una bolla che mi fa ancora sentire completa e che mi protegge almeno in parte dal vuoto che sento incolmabile. Allo stesso modo io ho potuto cristallizzare il suo mondo professionale. Ho potuto lasciarlo intatto perché ne sono lontana e sento la necessità che per il momento resti tale. Questa giornata è la prosecuzione del suo lavoro, è un tentativo bello e giusto di raccogliere ciò che ha costruito e portarlo avanti. È una giornata che guarda al futuro e per questo vi sono immensamente grata. Il mio limite però è che io il futuro non sono ancora pronto ad affrontarlo. Se non vi dispiace, preferisco restare ancora un po' ferma nella mia fase di ricostruzione. Ci sono qui i figli, Enrico e Pietro, che molto meglio di me rappresentano la parte dinamica capace di guardare avanti, forti dell'immensa eredità che Luca ha lasciato. Io sono con loro e con tutti voi, ma un passo indietro. Grazie. E a termine di questo volevo condividere giusto un mio pensiero che sfortunatamente non ho avuto la lucidità di mettere per iscritto, quindi farò del mio meglio. È un pensiero che si traduce innanzitutto in un ringraziamento verso Margherita e Donato, in primis, verso tutte le istituzioni coinvolte, verso i relatori e le relatrici qui presenti e tutti voi che siete venuti. È un ringraziamento che ci tengo in un certo senso a spiegare e che matura da una riflessione che ho avuto alla luce della locandina, che parlava per l'appunto della legacy di Luca Salvatici, è stata tradotta come lascito culturale, penso in maniera molto appropriata. Ed ecco, io da un anno ormai che alla fine in un modo o nell'altro mi sono ritrovato spesso a parlare o quantomeno mi sono imbattuto nel concetto di lascito o di eredità di Luca Salvatici. È un concetto che infatti è riemerso anche nelle parole di mia madre, che dice il vero, io e mio fratello siamo sicuramente forti di un'immensa eredità, ma io trovo che il lascito di, e ci tengo proprio a usare il nome completo, di Luca Salvatici vada ben oltre quello che può essere l'immagine che ha restituito a me come padre. Perché trovo che la sua eredità, il suo lascito culturale sia splendidamente complesso, molto sfaccettato. E questo ricomprende un sacco di aspetti, come padre, come fratello, come amico, come collega, come marito, ma oggi in questa sala come economista, come esperto del suo settore, come dottore di ricerca e come a lui piaceva molto ricordare, bonariamente a me e mio fratello in ogni occasione buona, come professore. A casa era solito che la risposta a qualsiasi domanda, per quanto stupida potesse essere, fosse perché io sono professore. Ed ecco, io trovo che una volta tanto, per così dire, Non sono io però l'erede di questo lascito. Lo siete voi che avete organizzato questo evento e potenzialmente lo sono tutte le persone qui presenti, le persone che leggendo la sua ricerca mai saranno incuriositi, ne prenderanno uno spunto e la terranno viva. E questo evento è un ottimo modo per permettere ciò, quindi vi sono veramente, veramente estremamente grato. E poi questo pensiero si chiude banalmente con un invito, dunque, un invito a tutti gli economisti presenti a fare tesoro laddove la ricerca di Luca fosse in qualche modo interessante per loro, e magari di utilizzarla in qualsiasi sia il loro ambito poi rispettivamente di lavoro, chiudendo però con un monito che era solito dire papà, ma che mi ha dovuto ricordare mio fratello perché mi ero scordato. E cioè ricordatevi che al mondo ci sono due tipi di cattivi economisti. Quelli che non sanno l'economia e quelli che sanno soltanto l'economia. Grazie.
Grazie, Pietro. We shift to English and to the scientific part of this morning. So my role is to introduce to you our speakers. And first of all, we will follow the order of the locandina. And so we will have as first speaker Alan Matthews. I think that everybody in this room know who is Alan Matthews, but is professor of European Agricultural Policy in the Department of Economics at Trinity College and fellow emeritus of the Trinity College. His major research interests are agricultural policy analysis, the impact of trade on developing countries, and CGE equilibrium analysis of trade and agricultural policy reforms. This morning, he will provide to us a broad overview of the evolution of the European Union agricultural trade policy, highlighting its multiple objectives and discussing its sustainability in the current context of international uncertainty and disorder. The second speaker is Jean-Christophe Bureau, who is professor of economics at Agro-alimentare and associate researcher at the CEPI. He is as well a specialist in common agricultural policy and working on international trade issues related to agriculture and environment. Unfortunately, Jean-Christophe cannot be with us today, but he recorded his presentation. So we will see his talk, and in his talk, he briefly reviews the main methodological advances that he and Luke achieved in the field of measuring protectionism. And he also discusses how changes in the international policy environment call for a reconsideration of the conceptual framework that we use today to analyze trade policies. The other two speakers will present recent research initiated together with Luca on topics that are firmly rooted in his core research area. So Maria Pina Cipollina, I'm sorry, I still continue to call you Maria Pina, but your true name is Maria. Sorry for that. So Maria is professor at the University of Molise. Her main research interests concern economic growth and trade liberalization and empirical analysis of trade and trade policies. She presents an empirical contribution, which is co-authored with Luca De Benedictis, who is here. And they use a gravity model to assess the impact of recent increases in most favored nation tariffs, while explicitly accounting for the trade diversions effect. And finally, but last but not least, Silvia Negri. She's professor of economic policy at Roma University. Her main research interests include international trade policies, and today we are very interested in her research on global value chains. Her presentation is co-authored with Ilaria Fusacchia and will focus on Luca's contribution to an analysis of global value chains and to the effect that trade policies might have on them, with particular attention to the agriculture and agri-food sectors. Finally, we have asked to Pierluigi Montalbano from the University of La Sapienza to provide some final comments to open the discussion from the floor. So I think that we can go through our contribution, the contribution of our speakers, and then probably leave at the end of the presentation a bit of time for questions and answers. Please, Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everybody. me just pick it. Can I first of all say that it really is an enormous honor for me to be part of this commemoration of the work and life of Luca. We met originally as part of a Horizon, I think it was called the Framework Program, but anyway, European research projects, and we maintained contact continually since that time. I'm not going to say anything more about Luca's contribution to our profession. It was an outstanding contribution. I was really pleased to hear Professor Kanata emphasize what I think was what I will remember most about Luca, which, from a professional point of view, which was his curiosity. He just had such a curious and open mind. But it also his human legacy. It's really terrific that Pietro, Enrico, Luca's sister are here today, and that makes it particularly special for me. I used to get a message from Luca every Christmas with a picture of the wonderful nativity that they had in their home. On St. Patrick's Day, I would also get a message, and unfortunately, those messages have now ceased. I actually just wrote one piece with Luca, which was also with Margherita. It was a paper for the International Agricultural Trade Research Consortium on the trade implications of Europe's Common Agricultural Policy. And therefore, I've chosen for the title for my talk this morning, a sort of a policy title which tries to look back and asks, what have we learned about EU agricultural trade policy over the last number of decades? The European Union, of course, has been long a central actor in the governance of international agricultural trade. Yet the objectives, the instruments, and the political logic of that policy have changed substantially over time. What began primarily as an external mechanism to sustain the internal organization of the CAP has evolved into a broader framework through which the EU seeks simultaneously to manage market integration, project regulatory standards, pursue environmental objectives, and respond to growing geopolitical fragmentation. This evolution cannot be understood simply as a linear movement from protectionism towards liberalization. Rather, liberalization itself altered the character of the policy challenges. As tariffs declined, regulatory issues became increasingly central. The EU increasingly sought to externalize elements of its domestic regulatory model through trade agreements and unilateral measures. And more recently, geopolitical tensions, supply chain disruptions, and renewed concerns regarding food and input dependencies have added a further dimension. So the central argument I want to make is that agricultural trade policy has evolved from a largely defensive instrument into a more complex framework that simultaneously pursues market integration, regulatory projection, sustainability objectives, and geopolitical resilience. And these objectives are not always mutually compatible, and many contemporary tensions arise precisely from attempts to reconcile them within a changing international order. So the sort of roadmap for my talk, very briefly, the historical foundations, talk a little bit about the move from multilateralism to preferentialism, the growing emphasis on unilateral measures, geopolitics and the return of food security politics, and then some conclusions. From the 1960s onwards, the original CAP combined high institutional prices, variable import levies, export refunds, and border controls into a system designed to insulate agricultural protection from world market volatility. We all know this story. It created a Fortress Europe approach, a large protected internal market sustained through border management. By the 1970s and 80s, of course, productivity growth had generated structural surpluses. We disposed of those on world markets through export subsidies, generating growing tensions with major agricultural exporters. The decisive breakthrough came during the Uruguay round and the 1994 WTO Agreement on Agriculture, which fundamentally altered the form of European agricultural protectionism. Variable levies were converted into bound tariffs, quantitative disciplines were imposed on export subsidies, and domestic support became subject to classification and constraint. Yet the resulting tariff structure still left European agriculture highly protected in politically sensitive sectors such as beef, dairy, sugar, and poultry. By contrast, imports of oilseeds and feed materials remain subject to relatively low protection. So if you can make out some of the figures on the slide on the left, the key figures I want to emphasize are not the axes, which is the share of imports in domestic consumption and the share of exports in domestic production, but rather the figures associated with each of the bubbles. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you see essentially the animal products together with sugar, high rates of nominal protection, up to 60% in the case of beef. And then in the top part of the diagram, we see rates of protection for oilseeds, for example, of the order of 0.3%. So this asymmetry, I think, was quite influential in determining the structure of production in European agriculture. The combination of high protection for livestock products and relatively liberal access for imported feed inputs supported the continued intensification and geographical concentration of European livestock production, particularly in pig and poultry sectors closely integrated with agro-industrial supply chains and port infrastructure. So in effect, the EU combined external protection for high-value animal products with openness to imported protein feed, thereby encouraging production systems that became increasingly dependent on global commodity flows. Although the EU increasingly defined itself after the Uruguay round as a defender of multilateral trade governance, preferential trade arrangements never disappeared. Rather, they expanded in scope and changed in function. What began as a limited set of post-colonial arrangements gradually evolved into a broad network of FTAs serving commercial, geopolitical, and regulatory purposes simultaneously. Following the stagnation of the WTO Doha development round, the EU progressively shifted towards a more ambitious bilateral and regional strategy. The 2006 Global Europe Strategy explicitly repositioned FTAs as instruments for securing market access, competitiveness, and regulatory influence. So agreements with Korea, Canada, Japan, Mercosur, Australia, and New Zealand, most recently Indonesia, have extended well beyond tariffs into areas such as SPS governance, geographical indications, regulatory cooperation, and sustainability provisions. Agriculture shaped both the structure and political dynamics of these agreements. On the offensive side, the EU sought improved access for competitive agri-food exports, including dairy, pig meat, processed foods, wines, and spirits. Geographical indications emerged as a principal negotiating objective. At the same time, the EU remained highly defensive in sectors such as beef, poultry, sugar, and rice, relying generally on managed liberalization through tariff rate quotas, transition periods, and safeguard clauses. Over time, EU preferential agreements evolved beyond instruments of tariff liberalization into frameworks for managing regulatory interaction. Because access to the EU market required conformity with EU regulatory systems, these arrangements often generated asymmetrical pressures for adaptation. From the 2010s onward, the regulatory content of FTAs expanded substantially to include trade and sustainable development chapters, environmental cooperation, and climate-related provisions. Agriculture became central to these developments because many sustainability concerns intersect directly with agricultural production systems. Following the review of the trade and sustainability chapters in 2022, the most recent agreements, although interestingly not India, have made commitments on trade and sustainable development legally enforceable and binding through the agreement's dispute settlement mechanisms. A further development has been the increasing resort to unilateral trade measures intended to reconcile ambitious domestic sustainability regulation with conditions of open trade. The underlying policy question is straightforward. How can the EU sustain increasingly demanding environmental, climate, and animal welfare standards for domestic producers if imports continue to be produced under less restrictive conditions? This development shouldn't be seen as entirely novel. The EU single market has always been based on conditional market access. Products placed on the union market must comply with EU regulatory requirements irrespective of origin. The so-called Brussels effect reflects the ability of the EU's large internal market to externalize its regulatory preferences internationally. The contemporary mirror clause debate marks a significant evolution beyond this earlier approach. Increasingly, the issue is no longer simply whether the final imported product satisfies EU safety requirements, but whether the production process itself conforms to EU environmental, animal welfare, or public health norms. This shift became politically salient during the implementation of the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. Farmer organizations increasingly argued that ambitious sustainability regulation would only remain politically viable if imports were subject to equivalent requirements. And the European Parliament played an important role in institutionalizing this discussion. The Commission's position evolved during this period. The 2021 Trade Policy Review explicitly acknowledged the possibility of applying relevant production requirements to imports in carefully justified circumstances. The Commission subsequently framed mirror clauses less as instruments of protectionism than as tools necessary to support global public goods and to maintain domestic support for sustainability transitions. The evolution of EU policy on antimicrobials illustrates this transition clearly, and a similar evolution can be observed in the pesticides debate, with the EU deforestation regulation representing perhaps the most ambitious extension of this logic to date. These developments have inevitably generated resistance among trading partners. Third countries have raised concerns in the WTO committees regarding compliance costs, legal uncertainty, administrative burdens, and fears that sustainability objectives may function as disguised protectionism. Developing countries have argued that compliance may disadvantage smaller producers lacking technical capacity. However, the mirror clause debate should not be viewed as a radical departure from existing trade practice. WTO members have long imposed import restrictions linked to production methods, where important societal objectives have been at stake, including animal welfare, the case of seal products, conservation, the shrimp-turtle dispute, human rights, respect to forced labor, which is again in the news with the new American tariffs applying on that basis, and biodiversity protection. So the novelty lies less in the principle itself than in the attempt to apply similar reasoning systematically to agricultural sustainability standards. Nonetheless, unilateral sustainability measures unquestionably increase transaction costs and introduce additional frictions. And the central challenge for future policy will be to minimize these frictions while preserving the legitimacy of domestic sustainability regulation. The strongest case for mirror clauses arises where measures address genuinely public global goods, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, antimicrobial resistance, or deforestation. Equivalence arrangements, transition periods, and technical assistance may be necessary to avoid disproportionate burdens on developing country exporters. The contemporary phase of fragmentation in the global trading system did not emerge suddenly. Its roots lie in the gradual weakening of confidence in the multilateral trading order. The failure to conclude the Doha Development Round undermined the WTO's credibility, and the subsequent collapse of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism represented a more decisive rupture, eroding the enforceability of WTO commitments. Within the EU, these developments coincided with a gradual shift towards so-called open strategic autonomy. Policymakers increasingly recognize the strategic risks associated with concentrated supply chains and asymmetric economic relationships. The renewed Trump administration tariff strategy marked a transition from commercial dispute management to overt coercive bargaining. The Turnberry Agreement illustrated this new dynamic, demonstrating the EU's limited capacity to insulate itself from unilateral US trade measures. Particularly significant for agriculture was the further opening of EU markets to selected US agri-food exports. And these institutional changes coincided with geopolitical shocks that exposed the vulnerability of global food systems. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the crisis also revealed dependence on highly internationalized input systems, particularly fertilizers. Russia and Belarus were major suppliers of nitrogen and potash fertilizers, while natural gas prices strongly affected nitrogen production costs within Europe itself. And subsequent tensions in the Gulf region, of course, have reinforced these concerns. One important consequence has been the re-emergence of food security as a central policy objective within the EU. agricultural organizations increasingly frame domestic food production as part of Europe's strategic infrastructure. The European Commission's increasing emphasis on food sovereignty, resilience, and strategic autonomy reflects this broader shift. However, this framing also risks sliding into a problematic equation between resilience and self-sufficiency. Import dependence is not inherently undesirable. Vulnerability arises less from trade itself than from excessive concentration on suppliers, dependence on unstable regions, or insufficient redundancy. A narrow focus on maximizing domestic production can itself create vulnerabilities, increasing dependence on imported feed, fertilizers, pesticides, and energy. The challenge for the EU, therefore, is not to retreat from international trade, but to manage strategic dependencies more intelligently. First, diversification of sourcing, particularly for fertilizers and feed proteins, is likely to prove more effective than broad agricultural self-sufficiency. Second, the EU will need greater emphasis on strategic buffering mechanisms, including public and private stockholding. Third, resilience requires reducing structural dependence on vulnerable input systems through transitions to lower input and circular production systems. Fourth, the EU has an interest in preserving a minimum functioning multilateral order despite the current fragmentation. And finally, the EU will need to resist the political temptation to equate resilience with protectionism. The more plausible objective is managed interdependence rather than disengagement. One striking feature of the contemporary debate is the erosion of the earlier political consensus in favor of trade liberalization. Agricultural trade agreements have become politically toxic in some member states. Opposition to EU-Mercosur illustrates this clearly. The intensity of resistance reflects a deeper symbolic conflict about natural sovereignty, rural identity, environmental standards, and the perceived direction of European integration. The evolution of EU agricultural trade policy reflects a broader transformation in the political economy of European integration. For most of the post-war period, the central political problem was how to reconcile industrial trade opening with agricultural protection. Today, the principal challenge is increasingly how to reconcile an open trading system with concerns about environmental standards, strategic dependence, and political legitimacy. This growing polarization reflects three distinct but overlapping concerns. The first remains traditional distributive conflict. Producers in exposed sectors continue to mobilize against agreements perceived to threaten farm incomes. The second concerns the relationship between trade and sustainability regulation. Farmers facing demanding domestic obligations argue that imports produced under lower standards constitute unfair competition. And the third concerns strategic dependence and economic security, reinforced by the recent crises, including COVID-19, the Ukraine invasion, and disruptions in fertilizer and grain markets. Yet despite these tensions, support for open trade among the wider European public remains stronger than often assumed. Recent Eurobarometer surveys suggest substantial majorities continue to view EU trade agreements positively. However, these surveys also reveal strong public concern regarding strategic dependence, food standards, and fair competition. Public opinion appears to support a more conditional and managed form of openness. The broader implication is that economists and trade policy analysts may have underestimated the political significance of distributional effects, territorial inequalities, and perceived asymmetries in adjustment burdens. The aggregate gains from trade remain substantial, and for the EU as a major agri-food exporter, open markets are economically indispensable. But the sustainability of an open trading order ultimately depends not only on efficiency gains, but also on political legitimacy. And this suggests that future support for open agri-food trade will depend increasingly on three conditions. First, trade policy must be accompanied by more credible mechanisms to address adjustment costs and territorial inequalities. Second, openness will likely require stronger forms of regulatory conditionality to reassure producers and citizens that imported products meet acceptable environmental and social standards. And third, the pursuit of efficiency through global integration will need to be balanced against legitimate concerns regarding resilience and strategic dependence. The central challenge for the EU is therefore unlikely to be a simple choice between openness and protectionism. Rather, it will be how to sustain an open trading system under conditions of heightened geopolitical rivalry, ecological constraint, and domestic political fragmentation. The future of EU agricultural trade policy may consequently depend less on defending trade liberalization in abstract terms and more on constructing a politically legitimate model of managed openness that reconciles efficiency, sustainability, resilience, and fairness. So let me just summarize my takeaways. Let me just leave that final slide on the screen, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Alan. This is much more than a broad overview of what has been the agricultural trade policies in the last 30 years, but really a lot of forward-looking. And this is very important in these days to be able to forward-looking what will be in the next future. I would like to leave the floor to the... now we have the video of Jean-Christophe. So if you could from the... Potete far partire il video?
Margherita asked me to say something about the work we have developed over the years with Luca on protectionism and EU agricultural policy, and also to give my thoughts on the recent developments on these issues. Over the years, Luca and I have worked a lot on the issue of trade and agricultural policy. Here are a few examples of the several papers that we have written together on trade liberalization and measuring protectionism and WTO negotiations and so on. Some of them with Linda Fulponi, with Priscilla Ramos, and with Youssef Shahed, and so on. Luca's contribution was mostly on the measurement of the impact of trade agreement, especially the Uruguay round, using what was at the time very advanced methods developed by Anderson and Neary, for example, like the Trade Restrictiveness Index that had never been used in empirical analysis before. We worked on methods for aggregating tariffs and constructing indicators in international comparisons, and also to feed trade models. We worked on simulations of the impacts of WTO negotiations. We worked on trade composition, the idea of shipping some of the better products rather than consuming them locally. And we wrote something about the unintended effects of trade agreements in the beef sector because of quality heterogeneity in these products. And we also work with Luca on several reports for the European Parliament on alternative proposals for the CAP reform. So what we believed in at the time, the world was quite different. We had 50 years of GATT negotiations behind us. The 1994 Uruguay Round Agreement on Agriculture had led to a rule-based multilateral system that we kind of agree with. We thought that the dispute settlement body was a big advance. Remember that at the time, a small island like I think Anguilla had won a WTO case against the US. I'll let you imagine what a conflict between a tiny Caribbean island and today's US administration would result in. So this is something I think we agreed, and we basically agreed that the Ricardian benefits linked to trade liberalization made sense, provided that the agreements were fair and based on multilateral rules. So what has changed recently on these issues? It's true that some 10, 15, 20 years later, such ideas seem a bit outdated. And nowadays, the EU and the Commonwealth countries try to uphold the principle of a rule-based multilateral system, but the system is no longer functioning because the dispute settlement body of the WTO has been paralyzed, because China has not played by the WTO rules. It has supported his industry, but also his farm sector, much more than what was allowed by the WTO. Jean-Pierre Buteau wrote a paper in 2011 that showed that the combined support, to Chinese farmers exceeded the combined support of the EU, the US, and the entire OECD countries, provided that you measured it in PPP, purchasing power parity terms. I think all of this that has destroyed my faith, I don't know, cannot tell about Luca's faith, but about freer trade compared to what we used to think. On the other side of the Atlantic, the very arbitrary trade policy has made trade very unpredictable. This imposes an extra tariff on imports that is not taken into account in the various indicators. This unpredictability, you can define a tariff equivalent, more or less, of uncertainty. And the fact that the EU, the UK, some Commonwealth countries try to maintain a rule-based system through the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement seems quite doomed because it's not working very well, even though the EU has made a concession to attract Latin America, and I think the Mercosur agreement can be seen as a way to do so. So, in my opinion, I think it's this calls for changing the conceptual framework, and in particular, I'm tempted to think that there's a shift from Ricardo to Roderick. What Danny Roderick said in his book, The Globalization Paradox, is an impossibility triangle that he defines. It seems that it's a more relevant analytical framework now. His triangle says that it's impossible to combine free trade, regulatory sovereignty, and democracy. And I think this is becoming quite apparent in agriculture, because when you look at the evolution of the CAP, and in particular the U-turn on any kind of greening, because basically we are back to the CAP before 2003, before the 2003, 2008, 2013 reforms attempted to green the CAP. And I think this is a relatively good illustration of Roderick golden straitjacket, that trade and competition is crowding out some of the domestic regulations. And I'm not sure that important directives such as the REACH directive can resist some of the large-scale free trade agreement. Another conceptual framework that has become more relevant than perhaps the usual Varasian framework is what Ronald Findlay and Kevin O'Rourke describe in their book Power and Plenty. And I must say that this is I've always thought this is one of the greatest books ever written in economics. Findlay and O'Rourke, they explain and in some kind of way justify mercantilism, because over the centuries, trade was a way to accumulate gold, or more exactly silver, to fund military that ensures access to resources and colonization. And I think that this has become very relevant. Different think tanks on foreign relations, including CEPI and IFRI in France, work on various scenarios. Some of them forecast a US-China conflict, but there's one scenario that deserves to be taken into consideration, is a US-China-Russia coalition against the EU. And if you follow what the Heritage Foundation says, what J.D. Vance says, this is something relatively plausible, both on geographically, which means seizing territories, perhaps the Baltic countries for Russia, piece of Poland, the Svalbard, perhaps Guyana for the US, perhaps Philippines, Caledonia for China, but also economically with the plundering of what is left of technological know-how. And when you look at this scenario, I mean, you pretty much into what Finlay describes for the 17th, 18th century. And so I think this kind of new mercantilism revives the Middle Age or the colonial era. One aspect is that I don't think the EU would have signed such a bad trade agreement or would have agreed with the concession made to Donald Trump on the trade if there was not a military threat, either that the US withdraw its support to Ukraine or even supports Russia against Ukraine. And so I think this is a perhaps more relevant framework to look at trade and protectionism nowadays. The EU response to these new threats with a cap that is more oriented toward the food sovereignty. The French like this word very much, but because of that, they sacrifice the environmental regulations. This concern of sovereignty is legitimate, but because of the weight of farm lobbies, this translates into the idea of producing more and producing more through intensive techniques, which at the end increase our dependency on really imported inputs. For example, you cannot produce more without the N, P, and K fertilizers, and for phosphorus, we depend more and more on Russia, from potassium from Russia and Belarus, and for urea and ammonia from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and for chemical principles from China and India. So this is not really an issue of sovereignty, this kind of orientation. So what to do where the EU has already started to reorientate its trade policy, prioritizing geostrategic objectives over comparative advantage. But the current framework is very worrying, I think. At this stage, it asks perhaps for a more protectionist response from the EU, in particular towards China and the US, and with the development of rule-based trade agreements with friendly countries. The bottom line is that all of this would require a more integrated, more coordinated, at least EU policy, the diplomatic side, possibly on the military side, and that's not the way the EU goes. And it's true also for the cap. The proposals for more EU coordination run up against the election of Eurosceptic parties, but it's also true that the cap itself is now a collection only of national plans, and the proposals from the Commission in July 2025 will likely increase the fragmentation of these policies. So it's up to the point where it's hard to see what the future of the cap will be, and I think at some point it's the fact that there is no longer any serious European value added of funding this policy is perhaps posing a political but also a legal problem, because it's the rationale for a common budget to fund such heterogeneous policies. So I deeply miss discussing these issues with Luca. I thank him for the 25 years of friendship and work that we have developed together. I also thank Dan Sumner, because in 2000 I was staying at Dan's house in Davis in California, and he told me, you should meet my student Luca Savatici. I'm pretty sure you would get along with him. Just go to the computer room and look for the guy with the largest head you can find. So I went there, I looked for the largest head guy, and I introduced myself, and we become extremely good friends, and I deeply miss him.
We cannot thank Jean-Christophe directly, but I will do it afterwards. So I think that his talk was very provocative on a huge number of issues. And so please try to write down your questions, so not to him, but to our speakers. And we will continue now with the different kind of contributions. And yeah, the pointer. Yes, we will shift to slightly different types of contribution. As I told you before, now we have the presentation by Maria Cipollina and Luca De Benedictis, and this is a true empirical paper. So it is not an review, it is a new piece of research that they have been starting actually with Luca Salvatici, and they are trying to ending up anyway. Okay. Enlarge it. Is it possible to enlarge? It is a bit too small. Okay, I think now it's okay. Penso che si veda bene. Full screen, please. Okay. Good morning.
Ok, scusi. Allora, in basso a destra, fare la presentazione, può aprire la presentazione sul...
Luca Debbe.
Ok. So, the outline of the presentation, I will discuss the motivation, just a PDF.
Maybe just control L.
No, F from this screen. Okay. Please, se può uscire per riaprire PowerPoint, la PDF. Ok, in basso a destra, sopra il più, sopra il più, ok, sopra, quello, ok, si può cliccare. Ok, modalità a schermo intero. In basso, modalità a schermo intero. Ok. Ok. Guarda. So I will discuss the motivation, the literature review, the theoretical framework, and the theoretical framework is based on ACS, consistent target margins, structural trade policy. So why this work? So why this work? Because we know that in the last years the US trade policy become much more protective, and especially during the Trump administration, leading to a substantial increase in American funds. And the present initiative has mainly focused on the direct effect of the increase of American tariffs on the volume of imports and price and welfare effect. But in Louis, another dimension that has received much less attention is the fact that the United States has a complex network of prevention agreements. Therefore, when the American tariff increase, not all the exporters are affected in the same way, and some countries continue to enjoy preferential treatments, while other countries face higher tariffs. This means that the tariff increase not only reduce the imports, but change the composition of US imports by elevating trade across exporters. And this intuition is the starting point of our analysis. Yeah. Okay. In this slide, we try to summarize the methods that we have in mind, and when the US increased the American tariff, non-preferred exporters become less competitive in the US market. As a consequence, imports from these countries tend to decline. At the same time, countries benefiting from preferential agreements experience an improvement of their relative market access, and if their structure of tariffs does not change. And this creates incentives for importers to switch suppliers, and the result is trade direction. So the question that we try to answer is what happens when the MFN and the bilateral tariff increase in a world where many countries already benefit from preferential access to preferential treatment. And in this paper, we quantify how changes in MFN protection reshape trade opportunities among exporters, and still use a structural gravity models. We can also assess the effect on domestic producers. The literature review. Our papers released to increase the strength of the literature. The first is the recent literature on US protection and the Trump tariffs, assess the effect of the trade war on employment, welfare, and third countries outcomes. The second step is the literature estimate the trade elasticity and assessing the preferential impact rate trade preferential weakness. And the third, the literature is the gravity model, the structural gravity model. And so in this paper, we collect these three strands of the literature. And the regular framework, our key variable is the bilateral tariff margin. It is a measure of the current margin in relative terms, calculated as the ratio between the SDF relative factor, which summarizes the multilateral tariff structure for product T, and the tariff factor factor faced by the specific exporters of I on product. And in this way, this measure is an index of the relative market access in international markets. And if the margin is below 1, the exporter faces a tariff disadvantage relative competitive exporters. If the margin is above 1, the exporter enjoys preferential market value. Okay. So when the MFN tariff increases, also the CS reference tariff increase, but the increase is lower than the increase of the MFN tariff itself. As a result, the bilateral tariff margins diverge, and for non-preferred exporters, tariff margin will increase, implying the deterioration of the relative market cost. For preferential exporters, tariff margins increase. Therefore, if the tariff preferential tariff does not change, the value of the preferential access increases. So now figure of so in this figure we try to show this change in the US market, and we have on the left side we have the situation before the MFN tariff increase at time 0. On the right, we have the situation after the tariff increase at time 1. The lower line represents preferential exporters, while the upper line represents non-preferred exporters, that pay the MFN tariff. After the increase of the MFN tariffs, after the increase of the multilateral tariff, the distance between the two groups becomes larger, and this is what we call the preference amplification. And so at the time 0, before the tariff increase, non-preferred exporters pay the MFN tariff, while preferential exporters pays lower or 0 tariff. So at time V1, the United States increased the multilateral tariff to the MFN tariffs, and the CS tariff also increased, but by less than the MFN tariff, and the tariff margins move away from 1, and so after so we can see that the bilateral margins, the low bilateral margins become lower for more preferred exporters, and the high tariff margins become higher for preferential exporters. And this creates generate trade direction, and so in this work we try to quantify this trade direction and the effect of the MF protection, that is an amplification of the existing references. So we want to understand what are the negative and the positive effects of the protection, not only for process exporters, because this adjustment obviously change the substitution between exporters, but also the substitution between exporters and domestic producers. The data, our analysis for the period between 2021. This is due to the availability of US production, tariff information with countries, and trade from trade, production data are from the production database and estimation by the US International Trade Commission. Under the descriptive analysis, we showed how the US tariff collection changed over time in the first year sample, the year in our sample, and we will see that tariff increased in 2021 with respect to 2016, and we can note that if we compute the reference margin in absolute terms, so the difference between the MFN tariff and the applied tariff, in almost all sectors, the margin, the preferential margin is very high. The position, looking at the position of trade by tariff regime, we can see that more than 85% of the US imports fall under preferential agreements in the sector of machinery, transport, chemicals, textile, and business. The MFN trade represents a relatively small share of imports, mainly in products and equipment, and duty-free trade is concentrated in few sectors, as mineral products, so since most US imports already benefit from preferential access, we expect that the MFN tariff increase can guarantee the imports across trading partners. The empirical strategy. We computed initial margins using MFN tariffs as a reference factor, estimate product level trade elasticity using PPNL, and we use the estimated elasticity to compute the CS reference factor, and then recalculate the tariff margin to use CS reference factor, re-estimate the PNL gravity models, and obtain the new elasticity. Repeat the procedure until the elasticity extends converge. And we use the last elasticity to estimate counterfactor analysis. We take the US average schedule in February 2026, and we compute the CS margins and predict the counterfactor imports. And then we compare the significant factor with the baseline condition to get the trade effect. So the results. The elasticity of substitution in the table, we have the sector averages of product level and substitution. In the column C, we have the mean, the average of the coefficient of only coefficient definition at 10% level. We can see that there is large heterogeneity across sectors. High elasticity for plastic chemicals, low elasticity for wood and paper, and so we expect that the MFN tariff increase generates stronger trade reallocation effect in sectors with high substitution elasticity. The slide just to show the CS tariff margin. especially countries from Africa and low-income countries. Because they are the countries that benefit from more preferential treatment. And the scenario of the simulation is based on the Trump tariff charter by the Council 2026. This policy combines economic tariff increase for various selected countries and increase the tariff by 10-15%, and sector-specific tariff increases for steel, copper, automobiles, increase in a specific sector by 35-15%. Results by sectors, we can note that the agri effect is negative, is almost 8%, but there are some sectors that benefit from these policies, and there are in particular textiles and foodstuff, wood, and others, manufacturing. And looking at the results by the broad economic categories, the large losses is in intermediate goods and capital goods. It means that art shops affect mainly the production networks and global chains. The results by region group, the first result is that the United States lost around 8%, something more than 8% of the trade, domestic trade, and the region that shows positive effect the South Asia, East Asia Pacific, the North are for the European Union, of 25%. By income group, results by income group, these are for the global income countries, so for the developing countries, and the main losers are high income non-OECD countries with a loss of around 31%. And so the conclusion is that protectionism and trade preference interact, and so the reason and tariff shape the relative market access in the actual trade in across sectors, countries, and groups. So the takeaway message is that high tariff relative imports across the trade partners, but the great effect is trade reducing. And so I don't say pay your attention, and I don't say okay, but I want that Luca. And so
Thank you, Maria. And we shift toward another topic, which was one of the topic that really Luca has explored a lot in the past years and really makes a lot of contribution, which is the analysis of global value chains. Both from a methodological point of view, he was really adding a lot from that point, and also by empirical analysis and results. So, Silvia, the floor is yours.
uscite della frammentazione, non bilateral trade statistics, and specifically looking at value-added flows. And in this way, we are able to identify the actual contributions of countries and sectors in the production of the so-called internationally fragmented product and also services. And in recent years, the trade literature has devoted considerable efforts to the development of some specific indicators able to capture both the level and the nature of countries and sectors' involvement in the global value chains. So now we have the possibility to use GVC participation indicators such as backward and forward participation, but also indicators that measures the GVC positioning along the global value chains, so upstreaminess and downstreaminess indicator. And these measures really help assess countries and sectors' participation position and also the exposure to trade policy effects along the global value chains. And so the first contribution is precisely within this context that was developed. This contribution was developed by Luca together with Ilaria Fusacchia and Alessandro Antimiani some years ago, and it refers to the construction of the GTAP value-added model. What was done? Basically, the GTAP value-added extend the GTAP standard model and database to the analysis of global value chains in terms of value-added. So this value-added module decomposes gross trade flows in order to identify the origin in terms of country and sectors of value added embodied in exports, where this value added is absorbed or used, and also backward and forward GVC linkages. Thanks to this improvement, it is now possible getting GVC indicators directly from the GTAP models, and also assess policy shocks within the global production networks. So thanks to this module, we can assess not only the direct effect of some specific trade policy shocks, but also the indirect effect, so the propagation of this effect along the value chain. And of course, it represents an added value and novelty in the literature from a methodological and instrumental point of view, because it formalizes and operationalizes the decomposition of gross exports in trading value added within the GTAP framework. It also provides a method, a module for GVC analysis that can be used also by other scholars. And it's also important in terms of a policy relevance, because it allows for better assessment of the effect of different trade policy measures and shocks on global value chains. And starting from this contribution of course, some outcomes originated in terms of the original methodological article, but also the application of this method to different trade policy scenarios. The second contribution I want to illustrate is related to the macro foundation of ICIO databases. And this contribution concerns specifically the micro-foundation of inter-country input-output databases through the integration of firm-level data. And we did this for Italy and France. So what we did was basically integrated the firm-level trade data into the ICIO framework in order to get a more granular and empirically grounded databases for measuring specifically GVC participation and trading value added. So we use firm-level import data, and we combine these specifically in the GTAP Amarillo framework. In this way, we are able to identify actual sourcing patterns of imported intermediate inputs. And why this micro-foundation matters? Because it overcomes some limitations that relate the standard ICIO tables that are very often based on the proportionality assumptions. So the fact that imported inputs are allocated uniformly across the sectors and users without capturing the heterogeneity of sourcing behavior. So it is an important improvement that to use firm-level import data and specifically imported intermediate inputs, and these attributed these more accurately to user sectors and countries of origin. This is just a schema to show how this ICO micro-foundation improves compared to the ICO basic and the ICO standard using the back classification. The value and the novelty, again, of this second contribution rely on the methodological and empirical aspects. The fact that in this way, by developing a micro-funded ICO framework, we can improve the allocation of imported input across sectors and third partners, but also from an empirical point of view, we are able to enhance country-specific information and at the same time preserving the internal and global consistency of the GTAP database. And again, the policy relevance of this work is that to support not only the computation of more accurate GVC indicators, but also the policy simulations based on a richer representation of production linkages. And the attention to the replicability aspects and collaboration, this contribution is designed to be transferable to other countries, so it can be applied to other countries whenever suitable. Of course, firm-level data are available, and this is a way also to not only foster the improvement of micro-foundation of global ICO databases, but also foster international research collaboration. And also this contribution produce some outcomes in terms of publications. The third and last contribution is an ongoing project, a research activity, and was initially developed with Luca some years ago, a few years ago, and on which we are still working. And this contribution refers to the it aims at refining the trade policy elasticities used in CGA models, specifically with a GVC dimension. And this focuses specifically on tariffs and non-tariff measures. The goal is that to provide empirically grounded parameters to improve the representation of trade policy measures and shocks, specifically in the magnet model and in the GTAP value added model. So from the point of view of tariffs, the aim is that to estimate substitution elasticities across foreign sources using a gravity identification strategy at the sectoral level. And then use these estimates into a magnet GVC model by sector, agent, and region. Concerning the non-tariff measures aspect, the aim is that to estimate sector-specific non-tariff measure elasticities, again, using a gravity approach, identification strategies by distinguishing between intermediate and final goods, and also between the different types of non-tariff measures. And then using these estimated elasticities in introducing them into the GTAP model, specifically to simulate effects on not only gross trade, but also GVC linkages. Also, in the case of this last contribution, the added value is a methodological aspect, contribution, specific contribution, because it tried to replace standard elasticity. We know that this parameter is particularly important in terms of basically simulate the effect on demand, on production, and also sources of intermediates. And we can, in this way, provided econometrically estimated elasticities tailored to the structure of CGA models, specifically with a global value chains dimension. It's a way to introduce heterogeneity across the sector, regions, and agents, and going beyond the standard specification. Useful, yes, not only for the research, but also for its policy relevance, the possibility to improve the simulation of different trade policy measures and shocks, and also allowing more accurate assessment of their effect. And once again, the importance of replicability. This contribution provides a structured parameter data set that can be used for model implementation for different kind of application. Before concluding, I want to highlight another aspect already emphasized by the colleagues, that is the fact that these research activities or these research projects can be considered as outcomes and drivers. So these research activities were both shaped by and contributed to a broad, wide network of projects. And many of these projects are the results of a very strong collaboration across researchers and institutions. Here I've just reported some pictures relating the BAT model project, the project that in which we were involved, recently completed, and also the current Act for CAP project, in which many of us are still involved. A last aspect that I want to emphasize is the attitude, Luca's attitude, the fact that he firmly believed in an evidence-based approach, and on the fact that academic work should be not an end in itself, or only methodologically robust, but also a relevant, useful way to society. And for this reason, he reserved space and times to produce studies and analysis aimed at providing concrete knowledge to inform the design of public policies. And from this perspective, he conducted together with us several studies, for instance, on the impact of free trade agreements or also on trade policy shocks. And I just reported here some recent studies aimed at providing these evidence-based policy guidelines. Some of these reports focus on the effect of Trump tariff policy, recent tariff policy, or also the effect of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement on Italian trade. And these reports were specifically produced for Italian public agency, just to highlight his interest also in this policy aspect. Coming to the conclusions, after having highlighting the richness and also the importance of Luca's research legacy, I would like to conclude by recalling another equally important dimension of his contribution. And I wish to remember Luca's great intellectual curiosity and generosity, already emphasized by my colleagues. And I want to recall his attitude, the fact that he was always ready to encourage new reflections and open new lines of research. At the same time, he cared also about involving colleagues, senior colleagues, but also young colleagues, students, PhD candidates in many research activities. And all these with enthusiasm, genuine enthusiasm, and with a natural ability to bring people together. Not only an informal way, in informal occasions, but also in informal ones. We remember has already emphasized in a wonderful way by Pietro, the wonderful dinners and the parties organized by Luca at home with his family. So his natural capacity to create a sense of community. A community based and created through research, collaboration, and friendship. And a community of friends, colleagues, and students. And I want to specifically conclude looking at this part of the story. Young members, students, PhD candidates, early career researchers. They found in Luca an attentive and available point of reference. Because Luca was not just able to transmit knowledge, but also to stimulate critical thinking and also fostering an active participation in the academic life. And many of those people, young and less young people, some of whom are here today, have become a community. A community, they are present and they are active in universities, research centers, in national and international institutions. And they are the true Lucas legacy. They are the seed that has grown into a plant and put down roots. So they, but also we, have the burden and at the same time the honor of continuing to cultivate, to carry forward those clear ideas, that genuine approach, and that sense of community and passion, all of which were Luca himself. So thanks to Luca and thanks to the community he helped to build.
Thanks a lot, Silvia, for this presentation. I would like to ask to Pierluigi to come and provide some discussion opening, and then I really hope that there will be some questions from the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Margherita. And of course, it's both an honor and a responsibility to offer the final remarks at the end of this event dedicated to the legacy of our much missed Luca. The richness and continued relevance of the lines of research opened by Luca, recalled so vividly this morning, are apparent and make it all the more difficult to speak about legacy. It's even hard to talk about trade policy without half expecting him to raise his hand from the audience to speak, and ask one of his pertinent questions, even if, as often his habit, he might have spent the whole session quietly working away his keyboard. He was the only scholar in the world that could do such a genuine multitasking activity. Personally, I tried, but I can do that. Let me begin by thanking all the speakers for the quality of their presentations, but also for the spirit in which they were delivered. This morning was not simply technical session on agricultural trade policy, protectionism, tariffs, trade diversion, global value chains, but it was above all, as Margherita reminded us, a collective tribute to Luca's intellectual contribution, to his way of doing research, to a community of colleagues, co-authors, students, and friends that grew around him, and his role of mentor that has been recalled several times this morning. What struck me through the morning was that each presentation illuminated a different aspect of Luca's multifaceted work, but yet all of them pointed in the same direction. Distinct approach to economics that was rigorous, empirical grounded, policy relevant, collaborative, and above all, intellectual curious. This morning was also an opportunity to pause and reflect on the state of trade policy and multilateralism. Unfortunately, there seemed to be broad agreement that we are moving towards a new era of trade policy, what Jean-Christophe recalled as an end of innocence phase, in which the previous consensus on the gains from trade is giving way to what has been called the geography of discontent. This was clearly depicted by Alan Matthews in his opening presentation, which was only nominally centered on agricultural trade policy, but offered, in fact, a broader and very effective account of the long-term transformation of political economy of agricultural trade policy, for a traditional objective of shielding farmers from external competition to increasingly difficult task of reconciling open trading system with concerns about environmental standards, strategic dependence, political legitimacy. More recently, this evolution has been marked by erosion of the political consensus in favor of trade liberalization that progressively appear to be with conditions. The central challenge, highlighted by Alan, for the European Union, but I guess also more general, is to move beyond the simple opposition between openness and protectionism, heading toward the so-called managed openness and strategic interdependence. In this respect, Luca's legacy is more important today than ever. He taught us, and he taught new generations of scholars, that measurement matters. Trade policy cannot be evaluated only through narratives. We need data, elasticities, simulations, models, indicators, and careful empirical work in order to oppose facts and evidence to prevailing narratives, misperceptions, and sometimes misinformation. He also taught us that distribution matters, that trade policy creates winners and losers, and that without attention to these distributional effects, trade policies risk to lose legitimacy. And that the second presentation by Jean-Christophe Bourreau made this legacy even more explicit. It explored the complexity of trade policy and recalled the unease of earlier scholars, Luca included, with a tendency to label trade regulations such as food safety rules or ethical standards simply as non-tariff barriers. The shared view at the time, and Luca's view as well, was that free trade agreements had to be fair and grounded in multilateral rules. As Jean-Christophe acknowledges, that world has now largely collapsed. It was striking to be reminded that support to Chinese farmers exceeds the combined support provided by OECD countries when measured in PPP terms. And in Jean-Christophe's words, Warasian world of markets equilibrium, we are shifting from a Warasian world of markets equilibrium toward a new mercantilism, geopolitical rivalry, even military threats. In this emerging landscape, trade policy is increasingly driven by geostrategic objectives rather than comparative advantages. And United States, China, and Russia increasingly appear as strategic actors whose interests and policies place the European Union in a particularly vulnerable position. And Maria Cipollini and Luca De Benedictis offered a concrete, updated, empirical application of this new trade order, starting from the observation that recent US protectionist measures have generated significant increases in US tariffs and significant decrease in US import volumes. They asked whether these tariff increases also affect the composition of imports. And the question which is important because tariff increases create disadvantages for some countries, but also unexpected opportunities for others. That is the logic of trade diversion, but analyzed through a refined empirical framework. And although the second Trump administration leaves a relatively little space for preferences, I must say, with both GSP and AGOA frameworks in trouble, and although the trade magnification effects of Trump's renewed protectionism via developing countries' GVC participation could hamper preferences, this is a really important point of view. But more importantly, it emphasizes one of Luca's key empirical contribution, the computation use of bilateral tariff margins. And this is where Luca's intellectual legacy was more visible. It showed how tariff margins can be used to understand not only whether trade changes, but how it changes and towards whom trade is redirected. All these may sound technical, but its policy meaning is straightforward. If we want to understand the real impact of tariff increases, we cannot look only at bilateral tariffs in isolation, but we must consider the whole multilateral structure of trade costs relative market access. The last presentation by Silvia Nenci, Ilaria Fusacchi highlighted another important aspect of Luca's academic contribution, is interest in agricultural GVCs, global value chains. And Silvia also placed agriculture global value chains in the context of a changing world economy, showing that GVC remain central even after the pandemic, trade tensions and geopolitical fragmentation, that these shocks have not reversed globalization, as some scholars feared, but they have reshaped it through regionalism, diversification, digitalization. For agriculture, agri-food system, GVC can still offer important opportunities, market access, income gains for farmers, technology transfer, productivity growth, upgrading, but these benefits are not automatic, and participation in GVCs, especially for developing countries, can also generate risks. Dependence on imported inputs, exposure to external shocks, displacement of domestic production, and unequal distribution of gains. In the GVC subject, Luca's contribution was, again, concrete and lasting. One of his most important contributions was the development with Ilaria Fusacchi, Alessandro Antimiani of the GTAP VR module, which allows researchers to provide simulation about the country sector origin of value added, destination value added, and the structure of value added linkages at the global level. This was, again, not only a technical innovation, it was a policy innovation. By expanding the empirical investigation of value-added trade flows, we can now provide more accurate analysis of a set of crucial questions for policy targeting: who really gains from trade, where domestic value is created at the global level, how exposed is a sector to imported inputs in a truly interdependent world, how do tariffs and tariff measures travel through production networks, how do trade policy affect not only direct exporters, but also upstream and downstream sectors. So these are all very, very important issues to keep in mind. The presentation also highlighted Luca's contribution to microfunded ICO data sets by integrating for-level import data into a broad international input-output structure. This work improved the allocation of important intermediate inputs across users, sector, and partners, and also the contribution highlighted have been the estimates of substitution elasticity for GVC-based simulation. Again, all these may sound technical, but the meaning is clear. Better data allow better policy analysis. If imported inputs are allocated inaccurately, our measures of value chain participation, exposure, and policy impact will be inaccurate too. Luca taught us the methodological details are not secondary. They shape the quality of the answers we are able to give. This brings me to convey the essential message of the whole morning. The four presentations were different, but together they form a kind of coherent intellectual framework. They tell us that agricultural trade policy today is defined by interdependence, complexity, and uncertainty. We live in a world where agricultural markets are open, but politically contested. Trade rules matter, but multilateralism is under pressure. Sustainability is essential, but difficult to reconcile with competitiveness. Protectionism may appear to offer security, but often generates inefficiency and fragmentation. Global value chains create opportunities, but also vulnerabilities. In this world, Luca's legacy is timely and valuable. He reminds us that measurement matters, that trade policy cannot be evaluated only through broad narratives, that we need data, method, elasticity, simulations, models, indicators, and careful empirical work. It teaches us the mechanism matter. It is not enough to say the tariff increase or trade falls, but we must understand how tariff alter relative market access, how preferences are amplified, how trade is diverted, how value chain transmit shocks, how policy effects differ across sectors, country, income groups. Above all, Lucas teaches us that, as been reminded several times, collaboration matters. Lucas' work was embedded in networks, national, international, academic and policy-oriented, senior and junior, theoretical and applied. He did not simply produce research, he helped build the research community. And perhaps is the most important legacy of his work. Today, we have not only remembered Luca Salvatici, as Margherita and Silvia effectively reminded in the remarks, we have seen how his work continues. It continues in the study of agricultural trade policy, continues in ISO protectionism, continues in research on tariffs, preferences, trade aversion. It continues in global value chain modeling, in databases, empirical tools, policy debates, but above all, it continues in this community. Therefore, my final remark should not only be one of gratitude, it also be one of responsibility. To honor Luca means, in my opinion, to continue the work with the same rigor, openness, intellectual honesty that he showed. It means asking difficult questions and avoiding easy answers. It means measuring carefully. It means keeping collaborate among us genuinely. And to recall Luca's wife, Silvia's opening message, Luca's legacy is not behind us, but is rather a shared task for the future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi. Now we have some times for questions from the floor. Probably somebody could come here because I don't know if we have a microphone in there. No? Don't be shy, otherwise I have to start. Okay, these are shy people, so okay, Donato. No, I will start then. I will start just with a question to Alan at this point, because we have listened from the Jean-Christophe talk. He's a bit pessimistic, I guess, with respect to you, to the future of European Union and European Union ability to cope with this new international environment. And he was arguing that he suspects that the new agreements free trade agreements between the European Union and developing areas, such as the Mercosur, will result in a destruction of all the trade and sustainability strategy of the European Union when opening to trade. So in other words, we put in the new agreements, trade and sustainability chapters, because we would like to, in some way, avoid the risk of a worsening of environmental issues because of trade liberalization, but then the effect from a political point of view is to weaken our regulatory framework. He was pessimistic from that point of view, and I would like to know if you agree with that or not, if this is what's happening.
Before I answer that or try to comment on that question, Margherita, can I just say how much I appreciated Maria's and Silvia's interventions, because I just thought they just reminded me so much of Luca's work. They were just so very appropriate. Thanks a lot. In terms of your question, I do agree. Jean-Christophe was somewhat more dystopian, I think the English word is, than I was. Although I did feel that we shared a lot of the analysis. I think I would look to some of the responses the European Union has been making. So in other words, where Jean-Christophe was sort of saying, there are these challenges out there of reconciling these three elements of the Roderick triangle. I do see some responses from the European Union. I mean, it is, I think, fair to comment that we haven't actually resiled from the more ambitious trade and sustainable development objectives. So following the 2022 review, where there had been a lot of criticism from civil society organizations in particular, that the trade and sustainability chapters in these free trade agreements were extremely weak. They didn't really have any sanction mechanism behind them, which was deliberate at the time. It was very much based on sort of cooperative approach. But following that review, the European Union, or the European Commission, I guess, who negotiates on behalf of the member states in the Union, did significantly increase the ambition. This began, I guess, with the New Zealand free trade agreement, which was a relatively simple one, because here you had two countries that were, starting from very similar positions, so there really wasn't much conflict. But actually that has continued. We see it in the Australia agreement. So essentially, I mean, you can argue how significant these changes are, but the Paris Agreement and the ILO conventions are now essential elements of these agreements, and that means that they are actually covered by the dispute settlement mechanisms. That also includes the most recent agreement with Indonesia. There are, of course, outstanding issues, particularly with Indonesia and Malaysia on the palm oil issue, and I think that we've kicked that to touch, as I understand it, and discussions will continue. It's fair to say that with the India agreement, we didn't push, we didn't manage to get that ambition level. You can say, India illustrates the limits, if you like, of regulatory projection by the European Union. It's a huge market, of course, and clearly the geostrategic implications were more dominant there. But just to end, a lot of the debate around Mercosur has been, is it fair to expose European farmers to imports from, with different standards? Although it's not an issue of the environmental implications, but I did refer in my talk to one of the early examples of the application of mirror clauses. So this is to do with the veterinary medicine regulation, which now prohibits imports of animal products which have either been treated with antibiotics, which is on the EU list of antibiotics which must be reserved for human use, or which have been treated with antibiotics as growth promoters, so included in animal feed rather than for purely therapeutic purposes. Those restrictions, if you like, on imports are just about to be introduced. And it's interesting that actually, we signed an agreement with Mercosur countries, including Brazil, but actually Brazil is not on that list of accepted export destinations at this point in time. So in other words, the European Commission has actually said, as and from, I think it's the 4th of September, we will no longer allow the import of animal products from Brazil. So I don't see that we have fully withdrawn from the ability to, if you like, protect. And clearly the European Commission, which was extremely reluctant at the time of the negotiation of the last reform of the CAP in 2018, when the European Parliament was pushing for this famous, some of you will remember this, the Article 188A, I think it was, which basically wanted a blanket prohibition on any imports which did not meet European standards. And the Commission was really trying to push back against that. But it did come around and basically has accepted in the most recent trade policy documents that, yes, we are going to protect farmers. This idea of a fair competition, Pierluigi mentioned it in terms of, no, I think it was John Christophe mentioned it, that the traditional interpretation of fair was in line with WTO obligations. Fairness is now much more broadly interpreted as equivalence in terms of standards that must be met. And I think the European Commission has really moved quite a bit. So we're going to see it with pesticides. The big issues, I think, will be around animal welfare standards. Because that's not so much an environmental issue, it's more an ethical issue, and defending that could be more difficult. So I'm more optimistic that actually the European Union has responded and has not pulled back as much as John Christophe has maybe suggested. Sorry, it was a long answer.
Oh, thanks a lot, Alan. So, anybody from the floor? Any question? Yes.
Thank you. I'm not an expert and it's not my field, but I used to ask my father when I read an economic news on the newspaper what that meant and how it affect everybody's life. Recently, the European Union struck a deal with the Mercosur to do a free trade agreement, as you say. And that had a lot of pushback from also great European leaders like France, for example. So my question is this fear more related as a political point of view because it fuels Eurosceptic parties and they're afraid to concede to them, or has some merit on it? Is it really some point that France cannot accept it because it's going to really hurt their economy? Thank you.
I think it's...
Again, in my talk, I did refer to the fact that in a number of member states, discussion of trade agreements has become really toxic, and France was indeed the country that I had most in mind. I read a piece in Politico, which was to do actually with the Australian free trade agreement, where a French a member of the French Parliament said he would simply refuse to go on television to even discuss this agreement because it was simply so toxic in France. So you're quite right that this has become an extremely salient issue. It clearly has gone beyond simply what I have called the traditional sort of redistributive debates around trade agreements, where you have winners and you have losers. I think we probably haven't paid enough attention to the losers, because they tend to be concentrated also in regional terms. But if we look at the way the Commission approached the Mercosur agreement, I mean, first of all, this is clearly my view, and there are other views on this, but we opened a tariff rate quota for beef in particular, poultry also, which was the first line of defense, if you like, and it really is quite limited. Most of the again, this would be an economic argument, but most of the quota that will be open, particularly for fresh beef, will simply be substituted from imports that currently come in under MFN terms anyway. So the actual additional imports into the EU market will be much less than the headline numbers, and even those headline numbers, 99,000 tons, is around 1% of EU consumption. So it's hard to see that the economic impacts are going to be of any real significance. And that's why I think the opposition really reflects these broader anxieties that people have about globalization in general, about loss of control. And this is why I think the trade agenda, also for economists, has become much more complex, because I think we have to address these issues. We can't just ignore them. And I think that was also what John Christoph was saying.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. I have a question for the two ladies, but I just wait if you have some question. Well, the question is the same for both of you. What's the next? So in these two fields, I mean, which are trade policy analysis by using mostly gravity models in that case, and not GTAP, but instead GVC analysis by using a lot of instruments, econometric analysis, and also GTAP and CGE. So I don't want that you disclose your secret project, but just an idea of what is in your mind, what really we should do in the field in which you are working.
Okay. The next, I want to answer a thing to Luca. He said, until there is a Trump, there is a next for trade policy evaluation.
There is a lot to do.
So the next is gravity models, and I continue to study the trade impact, the trade analysis of the quantitative analysis for the trade policies, and the problem now is that the trade policies has not a economic reason, but is a diplomatic arm. So it's very difficult to analyze the empirical effect, because the empirical effect is different with respect to what we think to assess.
But especially, this was one technical question, because you're using obviously yearly data about tariffs. But now tariffs over the year is fluctuating so much that I'm wondering whether there is a problem also in measuring correct average yearly tariff or not. What did you do from that point of view? You take yearly data about tariffs?
Yes, data.
And not monthly or seasonally?
Because
and do you feel that there is...
For the gravity model, structural gravity model, we need to have production data that they are not available. So usually we use yearly data, not sorry.
Yes, sir. Please.
If I may jump on this, because I was surprised to see that in your paper, the majority of US trade was under preferences. And indeed, I expressed some doubts because you know that Trump administration, together with raising tariffs, also tried to destroy preferences by not renovating AGOA scheme, also GSP scheme, and the only preferences that are in place are the USMCA at the moment, for what I know. So do you think there is still room for preferences to have such a big role, kind of trade reallocation? Because you presented also some simulations after the February 2023.
So that does not change the preferential treatment of developing countries. And in fact, Trump does not change the applied tariff for many countries, developing countries, but just for developed countries. So,
yeah, in the future.
In the future. So when I start to work with Luca, we assess the preferential impact, and now we have to assess the protectionist impact. So different preferences, which will be different. Big difference.
Silvia, what about the future? What are the projects?
Going ahead with the analysis of global value. Sorry. Going ahead with the analysis of global value chains, also applying different methods and techniques. We are working on, for instance, a network analysis applied to global value chains. So in order to study, to investigate the evolution of a global value chain after this geopolitical fragmentation, recent geopolitical fragmentations, and specifically focusing on the global south, so also developing countries who are involved in these global value chains. And of course, these are opportunities for these countries, but also they can represent in some sense some risk for countries that are more vulnerable also to these international exposure. And at the same time, our aim is that to carry forward the work and the research on non-tariff measures. With Luca, we started this research activity several years ago, and it is a tough activity. We encountered several problems and issues, and now we overcame some of these issues, and with other colleagues, also young colleagues, we hope to be able to go ahead and to get new results and outcomes on these. And the last goal is, and also challenge, is that to carry forward Luca's projects. Because he was a leader of and principal investigators of some local investigators of some national and also international projects. And our and my personal commitment is that to try to do my best to go ahead with this project and getting good results in terms of academic outcomes, but also evidence-based research useful and relevant for policy and policy making.
Thanks a lot, Silvia. Some other comments from the floor? Yes, Piero Conforti.
Thanks. Many thanks. I also had the privilege of working with Luca now many years ago. And I have to say today I'm missing a friend, and I'm also willing to express my indebtedness to Luca as a colleague, as a mentor in many cases. I mean, that was quite some time ago, but I still feel, let's say, the benefit of his being provocative, of his thinking, of his and all that. But I have a question too. And is there any evidence, any study with some kind of solidity and historical perspective on market concentration? I think this is something that may actually play a role, not only with respect to, the way trade is being shaping and the way, let's say, areas of trade have been changing, but also perhaps in the way tariffs have been treated. Sometimes they look more like, somebody said, an instrument of foreign policy, something that is threatened. We heard relatively recently in a good seminar of the Rossi Doria that many times those tariffs that are announced are not actually implemented the way they are. So that it's difficult to disentangle what is the real impact of many of the announcement that we heard. But again, back to my point, is there anything to do with the degree of market concentration in the industry? Thanks.
Old issues never... No, it's one of the weakness of trade economists, I have to say, and also for empirical trade economists, because we have really a lot of problems in addressing issues in our analysis with market concentration and market power. Voilà.
It's a very good question, of course, but I just noticed some of you will be aware that the European Commission set up a couple of years ago in the wake of the Russian invasion, I guess, of Ukraine, this European Food Security Crisis and Preparedness Mechanism, it's called. It's really another civil dialogue group. I don't think it has worked out quite as I would have expected it to. But anyway, they produce every 6 months a report on Europe's food security situation. And in the most recent one, just published, they actually look at this issue of market concentration at the individual tariff line level. And they have quite an interesting approach to do that. They first of all ask, are EU imports highly concentrated in a limited number of countries? But then they say for that particular product or tariff line, are world supplies also concentrated? In other words, it's less of an issue for us in Europe if our own sources of supply are relatively concentrated, if at the world level there is in fact a much greater variability. We may not be exploiting that, but if there is a limitation on a particular country, that there are other sources of supply available. So they kind of break it down, and it's a short piece of analysis, but it does address the issue that you've raised, and it gives a reasonably optimistic look that you know, when you look at the overall approach, we're not that dependent on specific sources of supply that would put us at risk.
No comments? No comments. Any other question?
It's connected with the notion of friendshoring, because the idea is now to reshape GVCs in order to be more strategic and managing openness. But in this perspective, I think there is the risk of higher vulnerability of European Union with respect to the trade counterparts. For instance, I was in Brussels last week to discuss about the renewal of the customs union between EU and Turkey. And it seems that everything is stalled, even if Turkey is a key player for our friendship friendshoring approach because of the issue of social dialogue. So all NGOs, all the social parties in Europe are strongly against any kind of new trade agreement with Turkey because of that, of course. But in a different world order, where United States, China, Russia do not care so much about these issues, what is our future perspective even in pursuing kind of friendshoring with our friends and neighbors that are not coherent, consistent with our social values? So I think it's really a risk of vulnerability. You mentioned this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierluigi. I think that if there are no more questions, I think that we can close this session. Thanks a lot to everybody. And for all of you that were staying here 3 hours without going outside, without a coffee, without drinking, without anything, but outside now, I think that something is waiting for you, good, we hope. So thanks a lot to everybody.